Thank you ever so much for that very generous introduction. It's a great pleasure being part of this seminar series, and I would very much like to thank Professor Bennett for inviting me. So Greece currently has one of the most liberal laws on abortion, and this was an achievement of the 1986 change of the law. However, before 1986, abortion practice was already very liberal in Greece. We know that dilation and curettage was widely practiced in the 1960s and onwards, and we know that from the work of Valauras and his associates. Valauras tells us that there were 100,000 curettages taking place per annum in the 1960s, and this was representing, at least in the urban areas, 1 every 3 pregnancies essentially were resulting in abortion. So at the time, abortion was used as a significant method of birth control, and birth control, I mean abortion and contraception together. So was such a reliance on abortion present in earlier times in Greece? If yes, when did this start and why? We know from abortion in UK and in US, we know about abortion in the UK and US, that legislation there in the 19th and 20th centuries was supported by the physicians and their associations, portraying an image of moral integrity, them upholding moral integrity within the society. And someone wonders whether the same thing happened in Greece. Some of the most interesting ideas put forward in recent decades in relation to the control of fertility are related to the potential use of emmenagogues and abortifacients before the onset of fertility decline. So Angus MacLaren, John Riddle, both of them emphatically argued for the importance of early abortion using abortifacients in the Middle Ages and the early modern period, focusing both in the West, roughly equating emmenagogues with abortifacients. However, subsequent research by Etienne van de Waal challenged this position, arguing that emmenagogues were used to bring on menstruation when that was delayed, the delay being interpreted in the past as pathological. So in this seminar, I will examine the knowledge and use of emmenagogues among the Greek population in the 19th and 20th centuries. If emmenagogues were used, what was the purpose of their use? How, if at all, were they linked to abortifacients? And how did abortifacients link to birth control methods? Essentially, are there historic pathways to birth control that have determined Greece's extreme reliance on surgical abortion? And this is the question I will be addressing tonight. This is part of a larger project which I carried out in the last 10 years, and it addressed the question of fertility change in Greece in the 19th and 20th centuries, and the results of these were published in the monograph Abortion and Contraception in Modern Greece, where the starting date there is very clear. It's when the Greek state was created in the 1830s, and I should really justify the end date that I have used. One reason is that because by this time the pill has become available, the pill which is really the most efficient method of birth control, of contraception. Another reason is that 1967 signals the beginning of a dictatorship in Greece, which changes quite a few things in the Greek society. But most importantly, I would say, is the fact that what happened from 1967 onwards, or generally in the second half of the 20th century, has already been addressed by a very interesting historiography. And these are the main publications of that historiography, which has addressed adequately, more than adequately, that question as to what happened in the second half of the 20th century. what none of those works has addressed is what happened in earlier times, and to a very large degree this is understandable, since the majority of these publications are anthropological works rather than historical ones. So looking at reproduction, I think everyone needs to use a number of disciplines in order to address such questions, and this is exactly what I did. I will mention here the iatrosophic manuscripts. I used unpublished ones, but also published. This is what in Greek we call iatrosophia. I also used extensively medical publications, so monographs by physicians, both in 19th and 20th century, and specifically by obstetricians and gynecologists. I should say that this is not a source that has been used widely. I have also used, obviously, medical journals and their publications. Very significant for this study has been the use of oral histories that I conducted in 1994 on the island of Mykonos. These are 28 interviews, mostly with women, and their life histories. I also have included some oral histories that I conducted at a later point in time in other places. Important, I think, is also the use of popular women's magazines such as I Gyneka, and within that the column of question and answers, questions by the readers and the answers that were provided by the resident gynecologist. And some of those replies actually were extremely interesting and enlightening for someone who is studying such a topic. So emmenagogues, were they widely known and were they widely used? The very short answer is yes, indeed. They were both known and used. And here I'm presenting the picture of Ruta graveolens, absolutely the most important, the most well-known and widely available emmenagogue in Greece. This is called Apigenus, and it was widely known by all. It's mentioned in a herbarium of the 1880s, created by a student, a female pupil who collected various vegetables and herbs from the surrounding fields, presumably in Athens, and that is available in Elia to be seen. Hippocrates, I'm told, also refers to the plant, as does the 10th century iatrosophic manuscript of Cassianos Ioponika, where we learn that it's propagated in Greece and that this plant is by nature hostile to pregnant women. A popular medical journal addressing the educated non-physicians, O Iatros του Λαού, in 1860s, tells us that rue was widely available in Greece and emphasized its importance as an excellent emmenagogue, but also a dangerous one for pregnant women. Afendoulis, in his Pharmacologia, Afendoulis being a professor of pharmacology in the 1890s, explains that a weak rue infusion was used as an emmenagogue, but a strong infusion was used as an abortifacient, in many cases killing the mother too. Physicians like Tryphon Kondos are referring to it, but also Aglaia Bibi Papaspiropoulou in her collection of oral accounts of empiric medics, but also of women's general knowledge on the issue. She's also mentioning the strong and magical powers of this plant. But this was not obviously the only plant that was available. Here's a list of emmenagogues that I have come across, not all of them, but I would say these are mostly the ones that are mostly repeated in various sources. And the sources are pretty much as the ones I mentioned before, iatrosophic manuscripts, both 19th and 20th century ones, mentioning, providing recipes to bring on the menses. And some of those recipes were, for example, absinthe boiled in wine, or juice of pulverized rue, or others involving herbs and drinking the produced infusion. Folklore information from Thrace in interwar period also provide information about emmenagogues and their consumption there. I mentioned Bibi Papaspiropoulos' work, which refers to Peloponnese. It was published in the 70s, and therefore the information it conveys refers to the earlier years. In a similar line, we have the work by Fragaki, who is looked at Crete, and she's mentioning fumigation with herbs, poultices applied internally and externally, but also a drink with rust administered. Scientists also provide not only lists of plants, but also the purpose, how to use them as emmenagogues, and they clearly identify the plants that can be used as such. And interestingly, Anassis, who published his work in 1961, emphasized that what he's publishing in his book about the various plants within the country is based on information that he collected from peasants or he witnessed with his own eyes. So this is telling us what is the popular culture in relation to emmenagogues. Even in a 1952 publication of an article in 1952 that appeared in the women's magazine Gyneka, we have an article entitled Herbal Drinks, and there is the reference to the emmenagogic properties of chamomile, absinthe, and Origanum dictamus. So it's not only the working class, the peasants who are using emmenagogues, but also this is something that is considered to be of interest to middle-class women in 1952. I mentioned already Afendoulis and his reference to emmenagogues, but also we have physicians who are explicitly discussing and prescribing and presenting emmenagogues. And there is a series of advertisements of emmenagogues in medical journals, which I will see and we'll talk about these. And these, by the 1920s, these emmenagogues that the physicians are presenting have become modern. They have become pills, they have become ampoules. So we have emmenagogues presented by the physicians in a different form, in a modern form. So what was the purpose of emmenagogues? As I said already, the iatrosophic books, when they present a recipe or a remedy, the titles in most cases is to bring on the menses, which is clear enough, I think. Empirics talk about irregular menses, and so the recipes really addressing this problem, the problem of irregular menses or excess menstruation, and all those are seen as pathological. Interestingly, in Fragaki's work on Crete, she discusses the case of how a mother whose the daughter did not have sufficient blood needed to use emmenagogic preparations to put the daughter right. So we're talking about an unmarried girl here who has issues with her menstruation. And it is added that if the girl suffers from period pains, that may mean that in the future she will be unable to bear children. And therefore, every effort needs to be made, especially by the mother, to remedy the situation for the girl so that she will not become infertile in the future. In the 19th century, Pyrrhus, in 1840s actually, Pyrrhus, who was a physician with university education, attributed amenorrhea and delay of menstruation to a very significant number of reasons. And I quote, great fear, confusion, sorrow, major illnesses, obstructions of the liver and spleen, illnesses of the soul, and also conception. And similar idea that conception is not the only reason that someone can lead a woman to experience amenorrhea is presented in the 1900 textbook prepared for the training of midwives. And the suspension of menstruation there is referred and attributed to various diseases of the reproductive organs. So amenorrhea was seen mostly as an indication of a disorder, except in the case of conception, but that was not the first thing that people would think at the time when amenorrhea occurred. And medics, physicians also were thinking alike. But as I said, we see here Afendoulis, who is really articulating that. There are many reasons that may damage the procreative organs, and emmenagogues are in wide use because of that, in order to cure such reasons. But also, by the 1920s, as I mentioned earlier, we have new preparations, modern preparations to address exactly the same conditions. So here we see an advertisement that, two advertisements actually, that were published in many different issues of the same medical journal. And the first one, ovarian hormone folliculin, is prescribed for amenorrhea, dysmenorrhea, but also for sterility, and menstrual for similar conditions. In 1928, Practicos Iatros also publishes an array of therapeutic methods proposed to combat amenorrhea, ranging across emmenagogic medicines such as iron, arsenic, and potassium, but also hormonal preparations like menstrual and folliculin. So the author cautions the reader against the use of old medicines, essentially the old kinds of emmenagogues, crocus, aloe, ergotin, and recommending these new kinds of emmenagogues. And some of them, for example, for hemagol, for which we know its composition, it's actually made up from the same ingredients as the old emmenagogues were made: apiol, absinthe, aloes, and the rest. And this is emagol, to which I just referred to. These modern medicines were used in exactly the same way as their herbal counterparts, as the numerous replies of the gynecologists to the female readers of the fortnightly popular magazine Η Γυναίκα indicate. So one of the readers attributed the fact that she could not gain weight to her irregular period, and the gynecologist immediately advised her to use emmenagogues, in this case Proliton. And this is in the early 1950s. So emmenagogues were used by women suffering from amenorrhea and irregular menstruation to put themselves in good order. and in doing so prevent or overcome sterility and therefore enhance their childbearing chances. This is very much in line with findings for 18th and early 19th century America, 18th century England, and contemporary populations in places such as Guyana. Such advice was in line with popular practices and was forthcoming from the qualified physicians, but also the unqualified ones. However, we don't have only emmenagogues, but in the various publications, in parallel to the emmenagogues, we also have references to ecbolics and expellents. And here I put them in the same list with emmenagogues, just to see that some of them could be used as either or. So invariably, we have references to ecbolics too. And these are, for example, in the iatrosophic manuscripts, when the reference is for women who carry a dead infant, a dead fetus that needs to be expelled. And these are always separate from the recipes of the emmenagogues. So there is a differentiation between emmenagogues and ecbolics and expellents. In a similar way, Afendoulis, the professor of pharmacology, also differentiates between the two. And physicians and Afendoulis also prescribe those ecbolics and expellents for cases of natural abortions, where an abortion has started, but where the woman needs some help to facilitate, to make the whole process quicker. Also, they're provided for labors preferably after the woman had given birth to the child, to facilitate the expulsion of the placenta. So ecbolics and expellents are referenced in the 19th century by physicians in midwives' manuals, but also in the iatrosophic manuscripts. So they are present and they are there. However, by the 1920s, we start having references to abortifacients. And these are there to induce an abortion. So there are few references by 1920s to ecbolics and expellents, and we start having references and articulating what abortifacients are. And we have here two physicians discussing abortifacients and discussing actually cases of women who had used various substances, other in and sought hospitalization afterwards in the Arataion hospital, or some women who ended up actually who died and they ended in the public morgue. And so these abortifacients are in many cases the previous expellents or ecbolics, but sometimes also maybe emmenagogues. And also we have another differentiation here by Bertsekas, who was writing 1948, but referring to his experiences from the 1930s mostly. He's talking also about strong purgatives, such as ergot, apiol, cantharides, absinthe, etc. And he's indicating the confusion between savin and rue, where savin is used by the populace as abortifacient, but he's suggesting that actually it's not an abortifacient, it's an emmenagogue, whereas rue, he says that it's accepted as both as an emmenagogue as an abortifacient. And we see that there is some kind of a confused use of emmenagogues and abortifacients at this stage around the 1950s. So this is again a letter to the gynecologist in the journal I Gyneka, of a reader who is explaining what happened to her, that she was expecting the day of her menstruation to be soon. She explained also the measures she took, but if despite all that, she becomes pregnant, her fears become reality, then the physician is recommending a strong dose of emmenagogues, thylacine, prosinon, and estrovide, which we already saw being advertised as emmenagogue. However, he moves on to suggest that if these don't help, then she should seek immediately a specialist physician who presumably would be able to perform a surgical abortion. And the confusion is not is also among women. We have here the informant cited by Eugenia Georges in her excellent book. And this is a woman referring to her experiences in the 50s, probably too. And it's one of her older informants born before 1920. And we see a situation where the informant is talking about being late and maybe pregnant, and she's quite sort of clear that she doesn't want this, and therefore she's using some of the classic emmenagogues, that is boiled onion skins or cinnamon, drink them on an empty stomach and hope that menstruation would start. I should say that these are emmenagogues, and at no point anyone referred to those as abortifacients, so that would have been clear to the informant. But she says that if this doesn't work, if there is a pregnancy, it would not work, and the woman would not have her, she would not menstruate. So on one hand, she's trying to have her menstruation starting, but on the other hand, she's clarifying that this is not an unethical thing to do, because if she's pregnant, the emmenagogue will not interfere with the pregnancy. So when should someone use emmenagogues? Apologies for all the writing. This is from Pyrrhus of Thetalos, writing in 1840. And essentially the essence of what he's writing is that it's impossible for a physician to know when exactly a woman is pregnant. And the most sure sign is that the woman feels the child kicking inside her. What is the word in English is quickening. I believe there isn't the equivalent of that word in Greek. I may be wrong. And so that is the only way to know that a woman is pregnant, and that is in the 4th month. If you think that things changed and become clearer in the 1920s or 30s, it wasn't the case. It remained as unclear as to when pregnancy is starting. And suspension of menstruation was not always seen as the beginning of a pregnancy. So much of what I presented up to now has evolved from Maclaren's, Riddle's, and Van der Waals' views on whether women employed herbal and other preparations as abortifacients or emmenagogues. Riddle argued that some remnants of the medieval knowledge of abortifacients survived to the 20th century in the West. In Greece, it was more than remnants that survived. In Greece, empirical practitioners, popular medicine, physicians in urban areas all provided women with access to and knowledge of emmenagogues until the end of the period that we are looking at here. And although the use of the term emmenagogues was abandoned by mainstream gynecologists in much of Europe and the US by the early 20th century. In Greece, it continued to be used well into the 20th century by both lay people and physicians. Knowledge and use of emmenagogic preparations for the well-being of women to avoid or cure sterility, and in many cases to enhance fertility and ensure that all was in order for the next pregnancy to occur, was widespread in the 19th and 20th centuries, and at least up to the early 60s. It was also understood that some herbs and substances could be used to speed up the parts of the delivery. I argue, therefore, that the knowledge of using herbal infusions as abortifacients was also available in the 19th and early 20th centuries. These do not seem to have been in use as such in the 19th century, though for those in need of an abortion could always be procured. Physicians were accommodating and supportive of the need to use emmenagogues for women's health and to guard against sterility. They delineated their expertise and modernity by using pharmaceutical preparations and later on hormonal ones. The aims were similar to those of earlier herbal preparations, and I have argued here that Greek women in both the 19th and the early 20th centuries were eager to regulate their menses, not only because irregularity was seen as pathological, but also because it would enable them to become and remain fertile. In similar lines, carottage, a medical procedure that was introduced in Greece around 1900, was used for the same reasons, that is, to address sterility. Physicians used the method extensively for that reason, though we know that from the 1920s onwards, it was also used to induce abortion. Now I turn to the Greek abortion law, which has been examined by legal experts such as Hionidou, Kastanidou in quite detail. However, it has never been looked in relation to physicians and their stance. We know that for UK and US, from the works of Kuhn and Barbara Brooks, but also James Moore and Leslie Reagan, the significant role that physicians played in relation to the development of the law there. The fight against abortion has been interpreted in both places as part of the war of legitimization carried out by qualified physicians in establishing their moral authority in society, aiming to attract and sustain the legalization and acceptance of their profession. A number of changes in the law, in abortion law, occurred in the UK throughout the 19th century and in US in the second half of the 20th century, in the second half of the 19th century. However, in Greece, there wasn't such an issue of legitimization of the medical profession. The Greek state already in 1834, 2 years after its own creation, ensured and established the rules of medical practice under the Medical Council, Iatrosynedrio, which was the only authority allowed to grant an individual with a license to practice medicine in Greece. Essentially, only those with a university degree were permitted to have such a license. So the authority of physicians was legally established in Greece right from the beginning of the creation of the Greek state. And the physicians at no point felt the need to fight for their legitimacy. So I will look now at the letter and practice of induced abortion law in Greece. This is part of the penal code that was introduced again very early on in 1835 by von Mauer, the Bavarian, who actually created the penal code in Greece. And this is the main article, Article 303, which refers to a mother who gave birth to a premature or dead infant, vrephos. It talks about a delivery, and it talks the delivery or the death of the fetus embryo, and prescribes quite high imprisonment, both for a mother who attempted that and whoever else may have supported her. This law remained unchanged and in force for 90 years. But I would like to look at what exactly it refers. So it talks about an infant, vrephos, a fetus, embryo, and a delivery. And it's worth exploring what the lawmaker and his contemporaries meant when using these terms. Nikolaos Kostis, the first professor of obstetrics at Athens University, writing in 1849, explains that some use the term embryo, fetus, after the conceived has been developed, whereas when the body parts of the embryo cannot be discerned, he's telling us, this is called by some κύμα or γονή. Nikolaos Kostis places the time at which the body parts become discernible at around the 6th week of pregnancy. We know now that it's about 10th week. Elsewhere, he refers to the egg, denoting the early stages of the fertilized ovum, and explains that prior to the 3rd week, the egg shows no signs of the embryo, while by the start of the 2nd month, the head is discernible. The legislation in the article concerning infanticide uses the term newborn child, neognon teknon, to refer to the newly born baby, indicating that neognon is the term applicable to the period of time immediately after birth. Thus, vrephos, which is used in the 1835 law, seems to be referring to the fetus in the late stages of pregnancy. It was not only Nikolaos Kostis who perceived the early pregnancy as not constituting a fetus. The lay population, and also at times physicians, refer to the embryo in the first 3 months as the egg, implicitly disassociating the early stages of the fetus from what the law referred to, that is, a visually discernible fetus. Women in the early 1930s explicitly made the point that what was expelled after their abortion was an egg, and thus any action they may have taken could not be punishable by law, the Article 303. This did not escape the attention of observers. The author of a short newspaper article dating in 1901, discussing working class women's attempted abortion, noted that, quote, according to her minimally developed intellect, the fetus, embryo, is not a human. It does not have the rights of a human, quote, close quote. His view was that the penal justice system had been too slow to realize that the fetus is human. So if what the woman carried in those early months of pregnancy was not considered an actual fetus, while the law referred specifically to a fetus, it followed that any action taken in those early months to end a pregnancy was not punishable by law. And of course, there were some dissenting voices emerging in the 1870s, for example, stating that the abortion law covered the period from the moment conception took place at the time of the delivery. However, a Supreme Court in 1905 judged they would stick to the letter of the law, and they, unless there was evidence of a premature fetus or a dead fetus, they would not intervene. However, by 1927, things changed, and a judge decided that even when the conception is recent and the fetus had not started giving signs of life yet, an attempted abortion would be considered as such. So only after 1927 was an induced abortion in the first 3 months of pregnancy actually punishable. However, to complicate matters further, there is another article in the Penal Code, Article 106, that indicates that a person who undertook an illegal act in order to urgently protect their own or someone else's life should not be punished. And this article has been used as early as 1872 and was explicitly linked by forensic judges to the action of induced abortion when it was performed in order to save the mother's life. Konstantinos Kostis in 1871, discussing this article, acknowledged the necessity for physicians to perform an induced abortion when the mother's life was in danger. He unambiguously articulated the mother's right to request action that would ensure her survival. And here the reference was to the cutting or perforation of the embryo's head while in utero. The physician's obligation, the legal expert Kostis stated at the time, was to save the birthing woman. And physicians certainly agreed with that, and that is what they did. In 1872, Pirlas clarified that an induced abortion was also justified in cases of extensive hemorrhage and serious illness of the mother. At the same time, other obstetricians explicitly defined artificial abortion in their midwifery manuals and noted that its purpose was the preservation of the mother's life. Venizelos also recommended that in situations where the continuation of the pregnancy will certainly lead to the death of the mother, then artificial abortion is recommended. So Konstantinos Kostis' interpretation of the Penal Code was that anything that, if there is an issue with the health of the mother, then the Article 106 provides protection to the mother and the physician. And in 1892, he explains that abortion is not punishable, not only when it aims to protect the life of the mother, but also when it aims to prevent damage to her health. And so we have a series of draft laws, amendments to the law introduced in 1924. The medical justification is introduced, making abortion not punishable if the mother's life or health were in significant danger. In 1939, the moral justification was introduced, permitting abortion in cases of rape, seduction, and incest. And the 1947 draft law reduces significantly the sentences, both for a mother who is trying to self-induce or for whoever may have assisted her to do so. And all these draft laws were introduced and became part of the law in 1950 when the new Penal Code was introduced. Someone would ask, and how many cases ever arrived the courts? Actually, they were minimal, and this was something that was continuously mentioned by the legal experts, that essentially the abortion law was never enforced, and it had essentially only symbolic significance. I should wrap up, I think now, offering some conclusions. So what it has been shown is that emmenagogues were widely known and used to enhance the health and fertility of women and also to avoid sterility. When women desired to control their fertility, the move from emmenagogues to abortifacients was easy and facilitated by physicians. The law was never a serious obstacle. In a state where a never observed law had forbidden late abortion since the early days of the state, but where contraceptives were never publicly discussed and virtually never advertised, despite the fact that no law forbade that, it was left to the respected and powerful profession of physicians to facilitate this transition. And all in all, the past, I think, fully explains what was happening in the post-1950s period. Thank you.